Hi, folks. This is Ira, and I'm recording here a walkthrough of the assignment for the major essay. As you know, that's a 10 to 15 page essay due on October 5th, the Friday of week 6. And that'll be due at the end of your day on Friday, whenever that happens to be. We're all on, different time frames. And so whenever your Friday ends is when that's due. That's Friday, October 5th. So this audio recording is going to kind of walk through the assignment sheet. As you'll see, it's not short. I wanted to kind of give you a sense of really what I'm looking for here and how I think you can do this and how I think it'll be useful for you. But before I say anything about that, I wanted to talk just really briefly about your discussion posts for week 3, which I thought were terrific. On the one hand, here we are in this sort of, in many ways, really gloomy moment in world history. Like there's a lot that is, not functional, whether it's, a sensibility in American political culture that seems like it verges on a new civil war, or it is catastrophic environmental degradation, climate change, that's already underway and ever faster paced, or it's the ways in which the flows of capital shape how digital culture comes into being and unfolds in ways that seem sometimes impossible for ordinary people to do anything about. Taken all together, we're in a lot of ways in a moment that feels, I think rightly, correctly, dark and difficult for democracy, and that's leaving aside the current cast of political actors, which obviously has some people in it who are not very friendly to democracy in any strong sense of the word. So I think there's a lot of structural features that today, the readings for week 3, and as you're probably already starting to find, in some ways even more so, the readings for week 4 really kind of bring home where the difficulty of the moment we're in, and the ways in which digital culture and digital media potentially contribute to profound democratic difficulties. So one of the things I find really heartening, though, reading your responses for week 3 and reading the couple that have trickled in so far for week 4, is this sense that at the end of the day, you are thinking carefully about the world that you live in ways that, if anything has a chance of changing it, it's that. So personally, I pursue an attitude I sometimes think of as pragmatic utopianism, and I other times think of as dark optimism. Either way, the basic idea is trying to understand the constraints on our shared world should precede our thinking about what we ought to hope for. So we try to understand the hard constraints. What are the features of the world that we live in that will, in any future contiguous with the present, any future continuous or adjacent to the present, what features of the present can't not persist in that future? Those are the hard constraints. So, for instance, the datafication of everything, right? There's no immediately contiguous future in which the world doesn't get ever more datafied. The algorithmization of attention. There's no immediately contiguous future in which algorithms don't sort and to a certain extent control ever more of how our attention gets allocated in economies where attention is a scarce resource. So those are hard constraints. Catastrophic climate change, hard constraint. But what's interesting is, even once you acknowledge and say, well, these are hard constraints, there's always ways in which the world is more flexible or plastic, the future is more flexible or plastic than our darker imaginings of it. And that's the sort of dark optimism. The optimism comes in saying, really, most of human history involves an awful lot of our species being just rotten to each other, rotten to ourselves, rotten to one another, rotten to others, like other groups than whatever group we're part of. Like, most of our history is a history of an awful lot of rottenness. And yet, and I think this echoes a note taken in a couple of the responses, and yet, in the midst of that, there's this sense of possibility. We really sometimes do pull it together and do the right thing. We, not infrequently, actually, not that frequently, but not infrequently, pull it together and create large-scale structural changes that are somewhat for the better. And so I think, that's the dark optimism. The darkness, of course, lies in saying, there's a lot of realistic reasons to take a dark view of the present moment. And the optimism comes in saying, and yet it's also unambiguously true that somehow we, the species that we are, which is so often lousy, nonetheless really quite often has pulled it together to be better. And there's the pragmatism comes in just saying, so at any given moment, here we are, we have to make a bet on what's possible. Either you make the bet of nihilism, or you bet on our own possibility. And so here you all are in graduate school doing master's degrees. Here I am, a professor, a scholar, and so we have all, in a sense, already really made the bet on understanding. On some level, all of us, whether thinking about it in these ways or not, all of us have made the bet that understanding ourselves and the world we live in better has a chance of improving things somewhat. And so that's the bet on ourselves that I think is actually a very pragmatic stance to take. We say, what are the limits? What's the cause for a dark view of our future and even of our present? And within that space, without denying the difficult realities that we face, what are the possibilities? What kind of utopias can be made out of the limits and the hard constraints that we face? How can we negotiate the kind of animal that we are and the set of conditions in which we find ourselves? And I think on some level those are really core questions for rhetoric, and really have always been core questions for rhetoric, and it's part of why I study rhetoric and why I think it's useful for everyone to study it, no matter what their career trajectory is going to be, whether you're an educator or simply for personal betterment or working in marketing or really anywhere. That question of, given a set of hard constraints, how can we negotiate better futures is I think a fundamentally humanistically useful question. So anyways, that's some kind of general thoughts reading through the discussion, and I think that kind of helps set up part of what I'm asking you to do and why I'm asking you to do it in this major essay. So as you know, again, it's a 10 to 15 page essay, all the standard, Times New Roman, 12-point font, double spaced, 1-inch margins, etc. And that'll be due again October 5th by the end of your day, that Friday. All right, so I'm gonna read a little bit of the assignment, and then I'm gonna talk about the different parts of it that I read. This essay will probably go on for another 10 or 12 minutes, although maybe shorter. We'll see. So basically, the thing that you're doing in this essay is you're writing a thesis-driven analysis of a digital artifact, accomplished with the help of a classical rhetorical lens, drawing from either Aristotle and or Gorgias. So drawing from Aristotle and or Gorgias. In essence, your job here is to construct an Aristotelian and or Gorgianic lens, and looking through that lens to analyze a digital artifact of your choosing with an eye to how it helps and or hinders its audiences in negotiating constraints. Your audience, i.e. your audience for the essay, should be scholars in the broadly interdisciplinary field of rhetoric, writing, and digital media studies. Okay, so the core thing that's happening here is You're writing a rhetorical analysis of a digital artifact. That's what the essay is. Rhetorical analysis of a digital artifact. But then the question is how and for whom? Okay, so the how is, through an Aristotelian and or Gorgianic lens. And we'll talk about how you construct that lens in a little bit. And for whom is scholars in the field. And we'll talk about how you figure out who those scholars are in a little bit. So then the why write this essay, why write this rhetorical analysis, is because you want to understand how the digital artifact that you're studying helps and or hinders the audiences that it speaks to or engages in their negotiation of constraints. So how does this digital artifact or this collection of digital artifacts help some audiences or hinder some audiences in negotiating the constraints that those audiences face in digital realms or analog realms in the world generally? So you're trying to understand how your digital artifact helps and or hinders real world audiences in negotiating constraints. And you're telling the story of this analysis that you're doing for an audience of rhetorical scholars. So you're telling the story for an academic audience. And the story itself is an analytic story, specifically, and it's Aristotelian and or a Gorgianic analytic story. All right, so to write this rhetorical analysis, you'll need first to think carefully about what kinds of insights, perspectives, and ideas become clearer when thinking along with Aristotle and or Gorgias. In other words, you're going to need to try and build an Aristotelian and or a Gorgianic lens. And there's a writing assignment that's devoted to helping you start that process. I mean, each piece of the essay, you'll see, already starting with the assignment that you just did, writing assignments that are oriented towards helping you build toward the essay itself. In this case, part of what you're doing is, in a sense, it's the work of a lens grinder. That is to say, you're making a lens that has to be ground down from the totality of Aristotle's rhetoric or the totality of Gorgias's encomium of Helen, which is quite a bit shorter. But either way, you don't want the totality. You just want the little lens. You want a piece of it. And to get a piece of it, you've got to explain and think through some core idea or concept from Aristotle and or Gorgias. So, and when you do so, part of what you're saying is, what idea or small cluster of ideas can you take from these thinkers, or just one of the two, to help you examine how your digital artifact impacts its audience's abilities to negotiate constraints? So, what ideas can you take from Aristotle and or Gorgias that are going to help you in some way analyze your digital artifact? Why are the ideas you're taking useful? How do they fit together? In other words, like, how do your ideas that you're going to use in your, say, Aristotelian lens fit in with the general scope of the rhetoric? What sorts of things do they help you to notice in your digital artifact? In other words, what can you see using this lens that is harder to see without it? Then the primary work of your major essay will, of course, be the rhetorical analysis itself. And you conduct that analysis by looking through the lens at the digital artifact. To develop and write this rhetorical analysis, you'll need to carefully examine your digital artifact from multiple angles, asking, what does it do? Drawing on your lens, you'll examine how the component elements or the different facets of your digital artifact fit together, and how, taken together, the facets or elements of your digital artifact seem likely to impact audiences. And I want to kind of caution you, think in terms of audiences plural. Even for a digital artifact that only has one audience that's intended most objects in the digital world are intrinsically capable of reaching multiple audiences. That's what shareability or spreadability or virality reference is the way that digital artifacts reach multiple audiences, often well beyond their original intended audience. So I'm going to skip through some stuff, but I do want to encourage you very strongly to read through. I just don't want to read the whole thing to you because that's, you have eyes. I do want to, highlight again that part of what you're asking is, how does your digital artifact foster or enable, and how does it hinder or constrain the ways in which its audiences negotiate constraints themselves? So what is it doing to and or for its audiences? Ultimately, your central argument for the essay should be a non-obvious but reasonable claim about how your digital artifact works to foster and or hinder its audiences in negotiating some constraints. It looks like I've got a stray stray mark there. Sorry about that. So let's just get rid of that. Your central argument for the essay should be a non-obvious but reasonable claim about how your digital artifact works to foster and or hinder its audiences in negotiating some constraints. And your Aristotelian and or Gorgianic lens should help you connect the details of the digital artifact to the non-obvious claim you're making about how that artifact functions. Taken all together, then, your essay should proceed through a careful working out of why the details of the digital artifact mean what you say that they mean, and your essay should address the who cares question. Why should your audience, your scholarly audience, care about this analysis that you're making? So, and I want to highlight this here, the simplest way to make sure that you're adequately addressing a real disciplinary community is to look at recent work in peer-reviewed academic journals. Got a few typos in here, sorry. Some journals that might be relevant for your work include the following. And I listed a collection of journals. So what I want to really strongly encourage you to do, you can do this sooner or you can do it later, but you should do it before sitting down to write the major essay proper, is once you have a sense, this might not be this week, it might be next week, it might be at the end of this week, but it's coming up. Once you have a little bit of a sense of what you think is going on with your digital artifact, what your kind of initial set of analyses are, I want you to look at recent copies of the different journals. You can get all of these through the Klein library. We have I think all of these in databases in JSTOR or Project Muse or EBSCO or Mass Media Complete. I think between those four, I think we have these all. And so basically what you should be doing is just kind of scanning through. Pick a couple that you just like the title of the journal, or if you know about the journals a little bit, ones that seem like they're the kinds of journals that have people in them that you would want to speak to, and just kind of skim abstracts. I'm not really asking you right off the bat to read articles, but skim a few abstracts. See what people are talking about that's relevant to your digital artifact, the way that you're studying it, and also like the artifact itself, or artifacts like it. So here what you're trying to do is you're looking at what other academics are writing in peer-reviewed scholarly journals, and this is just sort of a list of possibles. You're looking at what other academics are writing in peer-reviewed scholarly journals as a way of trying to get a sense of what does the conversation about this look like for academics in this field right now. Now, you don't have to write a journal article. That's not the assignment. But I do want you to be starting to think about, how does your work, how does your analysis fit into the field? What questions are other people in the field asking, and what positions are they staking out, and how does your sense of things sort of fit into that? So in here I've asked that, what are other scholars writing about your specific digital artifact or about digital artifacts like it? What are others in rhetorical studies thinking about your digital artifact or others like it? What are some of the key questions other people are posing? What are some of the key positions other people are taking? How does your idea and ultimately your thesis relate to these ongoing scholarly conversations? So the idea is to practice, and I don't need you to be doing this like awesomely. If you are, super, that's great. That's really cool. But if you're not, that doesn't really worry me a lot. I do need you to be practicing doing this, is figuring out what the conversation in a field is looking like at a given moment, and thinking about how the thing that you want to say, the analysis that you want to make, how that fits into that disciplinary conversation. So what I've said here is, with all this in mind, write your scholarly essay as a contribution to an ongoing conversation. How does your analysis mesh and or not mesh with what other scholars are finding or arguing in peer-reviewed journals? So this is kind of how you're fitting yourself into that conversation. And I want to note too, you might find it helpful to look back at the essay that you summarized and critiqued last week or the week before last, whatever that was, and think about ways in which that might serve as a model for your essay. Do you want to write an essay that looks kind of like that? If so, how? If not, why? How not, or why not? Use the essay that you summarized and critiqued from the Kennerly and Pfister collection as a kind of a springboard for thinking about what exactly it is that you want to do in your essay. What kind of story do you want to tell? Do you want to tell a story that's like that story? If so, how? If not, why not? And what do you want to do instead? All right. I'm going to run really quickly through the logistics, and that's where we'll end this screencast. So basically, you write a major essay that is polished and thesis-driven. It's an essay of 10 to 15 double-spaced, 12-point Times New Roman font pages in which you use an Aristotelian and or a Gorgianic lens to rhetorically analyze a digital artifact of your choosing. That's the assignment. That's what you're doing. The digital artifact itself is sufficiently small. That is to say, it's not just totally, purely conceptual. It has some concrete details that you can productively analyze closely without resorting to overbroad generalizations. Man, I got all kinds of typos in here. Sorry about that. Anyway, so the rhetorical analysis proceeds from an arguable claim through the articulation of a lens to the laying out of a detail-driven analytic argument, and it helps a scholarly reader to see its contribution or value to an ongoing conversation in rhetorical studies. Then the thing that it's doing, the core question that it's asking and answering, your major essay carefully considers how your digital artifact shapes its audience's ability to negotiate some constraints. That's really what you're looking at, the shaping force of the digital artifact that you're studying. Your major essay draws explicitly, via citation and explanation, on Aristotle and or Gorgias, and closely analyzes the details of the digital artifact you've chosen. Now here we come to the scholarly conversation. Your major essay cites at least 3 of the articles, books, or book chapters we have read in class together. In other words, you're situating your article in the scholarly context that our class itself is situated in. Over and above that, your major essay engages with at least 2 peer-reviewed articles, for example, from the journals listed above, by way of situating your argument within an ongoing scholarly conversation in the field. And to do that, after you've looked through a bunch of abstracts, you will need to read, 2 or 3 or 4 articles to find ones that you want to directly argue with or draw from or what have you. Structurally, your major essay has a clear beginning, middle, and end, and it makes clear the utility or significance of your rhetorical analysis in some larger scheme of things. It answers the so what question. Why do we care? Why does this matter? It helps us, your readers, presumably your scholarly audience. I mean, obviously, I'm your basic reader here, but you're writing to a larger disciplinary audience that you're building in your own mind. It helps that audience think both in disciplinary ways relative to ongoing scholarly conversations, but also in some larger way about why this matters, what the stakes are, who cares. And then finally, you email me your major essay by the end of your day, whenever that is, on Friday, October 5th, which is week 6 of our course. Okay, so that's the kind of breakdown of the major essay. Now, I hope it'll be clear why I didn't want to give you this information earlier. So my goal here was to have you kind of work out for yourselves what kinds of stuff you're interested in without trying to write it to an assignment. Now that you have a sense in your writing assignment 2 that you just did, of what kinds of things you would want to study as a digital artifact, now take that and look at this assignment sheet, listen back through this screencast if you'd like to, and think about, all right, cool, how might you study that digital artifact in this sort of way? How might you pursue this kind of analysis of that digital artifact? And what you're going to be getting from me over the course of this week is each of you will get an email from me with 2 to 5 questions. It's not going to be a lot of questions. It's just 2 to 5 questions that I hope will be helpful in thinking about your digital artifact in this way. Now, that might be questions that are asking you to specify the digital artifact more tightly in some cases. In other cases, it's going to be questions that are sort of preliminary analytic questions or challenges to your own preliminary analysis. It varies. I've kind of glanced at these so far, but I haven't had the chance yet to go through them carefully. But what you're going to be getting from me over the course of the coming week, by Sunday of the coming weekend, you're going to be getting 2 to 5 questions in the mail in your email from me about the writing assignment that you just did, the small one. I hope it's clear that small assignment you just did is the basis for this major essay. Everything else that you're doing between now and the major essay builds up toward the major essay. Then the week after that, you have an assignment that helps you build toward the final assignment for the course, which is your purpose-built digital artifact. And in a kind of a similar way, I'll be providing that final assignment, a couple weeks from now, also with a long walkthrough. It'll be a whole thing. I hope that this walkthrough of this has been helpful. I encourage you to email me to suggest some times that we could make an appointment if you'd like to talk with me. Several of you have already done so, either in person or via Skype, and that's been great. I'm really available to work through your ideas with you, and I look forward to talking soon. And again, keep an eye out for an email from me over the coming week. I look forward to continuing to read you and talk more soon. Thanks.